Okay, you have made it to the final section. We are still in the realm of boundaries, and now we seek to ask the next question. Domestic market saturated, or pressure from other firms in the industry. What can the firm do? Well, we know that we live in a global economy, and this has been the solution. If you need more revenue, if you need a chance to grow, sometimes you just have to leave. So when firms need a change in strategy, when they need to think about economies of scale, changing cost structure, being closer to resources, thinking about where they could increase horizontal bounds, where they might be able to vertically integrate, again, closer to the supply chain, where they may not have competition, so reduction in market pressure, where they may face easier political, economic, social, and maybe advanced technological capacity, they might seek to internationalize. So that's the last subject of your paper. You're asking, has my company or has my group internationalized, and why did they do it? And if they haven't yet, when might they? What kind of conditions would they look for? And why would it make economic sense? So we'll go through just a few ideas that will help you to focus on this question of the global bounds of your strategic group. The question might be, well, why do it? A couple of easy first takes. Well, the size of the firm. Sometimes firms want to grow, so they may need to leave their domestic market. Sometimes firms become so large that they need to leave their domestic market. Secondly, the domestic market might be saturated entirely. So again, leave the domestic market. Now, there might be some different ways that this goes down. So thinking about the propensity of this internationalization, again, it could be a large firm with a small market and they want to expand to finally achieve some type of economies of scale and lower that cost per unit. Sometimes you see firms following their competitors. If the competitive advantage is that the one rival firm has a greater access to buyers, then a way to respond is for their rival to follow. Sometimes you see a slow internationalization process, and you may not see it happen immediately. Large companies like Walmart, for example, spent a lot of time with a domestic focus, and only in the last 20 years or so have really started to think about how to advance into other countries. Their model was very US specific. How will they take that same model and put it into a international based environment? Lastly, you sometimes see a small firm in a large market and who likes being in that size, has figured out the operations of that size, and believes that they might be able to commit to multiple markets where they are small. So keeping a small size but entering into different large markets. You're asking yourself, well, where do my firms in the strategic group, where do they reside? Now, I've already mentioned this a little bit, but yeah, Walmart has definitely been the case of a slow internationalizer. And I like to bring this up because people in the United States, we know that there's a Walmart almost everywhere. And it's gotten to the point where there are so many that if you look at the Walmart locations in the US, one of the links above, you will see it's pretty much everywhere. They focused on rural areas. They now have focused on metro areas. We know that they have changed store type. We know that they have basically started to enter into lots of different ways so that consumers will go to Walmart or one of Walmart's smaller based stores like neighborhood markets and things like that. But Walmart has recently decided that the domestic market has become essentially saturated with their own operations. And big box has been on the decline given competition from online retail, in which case they have sought to internationalize in the last 20 years to refresh their revenue base and also to put their footprint in emerging markets. So take a look at these couple of clips here and get a sense of how they have had to operate in other countries. Clearly, everybody had a mad rush to get to China given their GDP growth in the last 30 years. Yet, Walmart is a very US-centric idea, and they have had a very difficult time figuring out how to be international. And I think that you'll get a sense of that in the clip on Walmart strategy. So just our first example of looking at what does it take for a company to leave their domestic market and what things would they have to think about? Just real quickly, they have to basically do a completely new industry analysis when they enter into a new industrial environment, which would mean there is a different history of the rival firms. There are different market conditions and different market concentrations. There is different five forces. There are different pest forces. There are firms that have dominated the vertical supply chain. There are firms that have entered into different forms of horizontal integration. And these would be the things that a company would have to think about as they sought to move out of their domestic market. So that all being said, basically I can summarize it by looking at the entire class as to the reasons for internationalization. I've got my industry-based conditions, five forces. I've got my resource-based conditions, seeking competitive advantage. And I've got my institutional-based considerations. This is things like our pest analysis, avoiding regulatory risks, may have to consider trade barriers. Clearly, this has been an issue recently. There are issues with economic conditions related to currency. Firms will have to adjust their cultural empathy and start to think, well, how is it like in other countries? Can I employ the same cultural tactics from one place to the next? Probably not. What are the institutional norms? This can even start to impact things like who they hire and how labor is treated and how management is treated relative to labor. Institutional factors that are very different around the world. So we can use the entire industry analysis that we've conducted in the last 8 weeks to ask the question of what happens when you leave your domestic industry and enter into a foreign industry. So if we started just to look at kind of these industry-based characteristics, notice what we see: rivalry, entry barriers, supplier power, buyer power, substitute products. Again, all of these things will relate first to the domestic market and then thinking about the international market. So quickly, yeah, rivalry. If your rival has gone, does it make sense for you to go? Does that keep competitive par? Entry barriers. It may be easier to enter a new market and reach scale economies, lowering that cost per unit. You might even see that firms leave to gain a edge on the suppliers in their domestic market by moving to the source of the supply and then buying up that chain or becoming partners in that chain. Think about oil companies. Oil companies move to the source. Buyers. If you have a new audience, do they have the same information that domestic market has accumulated over the life of your business? Entering a foreign situation may result in less buyer power as they have not yet achieved the level of information associated with understanding price and value proposition. You could also see how that could backfire. Creating substitute products, right? So you become the substitute product as you enter into the foreign market. Now, from our value-based considerations, why might you do this? Well, first, you're going to have to be able to do it. So if you do seek that competitive advantage, you have to be ready to be able to do this. You must have the resources to be able to do this. So if we're thinking about your firms, the question you might want to ask is, what were the reasons or what were the capabilities of these firms to move overseas? And did it work? I provide an example here of Domino's. It took Domino's a couple of decades, few decades, to figure out the domestic market enough and the franchise model enough so that they could say, well, what would it take to operate in Mexico? What would it take to operate in India? What would it take to operate in England? And later in this PowerPoint presentation, and the main one in your files on Canvas, you'll see that they really had to focus on understanding different cultures. Another example is Superbus. You may not be familiar with Superbus, but they are a rival to Greyhound. They entered into our US market just recently in relative terms to the history of Greyhound. And whereas Greyhound has been considered not necessarily the best ride, Superbus had some resources and experience from their foreign operation, well, foreign to us, that allowed them to compete in a superior way with Greyhound. So you can actually check out some of those clips later on, particularly with Domino's. Um, Now, do they have the ability to go overseas? Sometimes you see companies leave because they want to enter into a world where the intellectual property laws are not as fixed, and they may be able to do things that they are not able to do in their domestic market. Okay, now there could be some other issues that come about as to why a firm would internationalize, or at least what they would also need to think about. And it comes down to two sides of this coin, regulatory risks. So firms may enter because regulatory risks are lower. Firms may not enter because regulatory risks are high. Many countries in the world are not necessarily very nice to foreign companies entering into their country. If they do, they have to obey very different sets of rules than domestic firms. They may have to employ domestic labor rather than bringing their own workers from their home country. They may have to pay taxes that exceed, because basically countries are always going to have some type of protectionist policy. At least advanced countries are having protectionist policy for their domestic industry. Rival firms from outside will face different restrictions if they would like access to those markets. Now, the question then might be, well, why did they enter where they did? Again, I've kind of alluded to, well, maybe it's closer to the supply chain. There could be specific geographic advantages, close to a port. There could be certain types of human capital issues, certain types of labor. So if you think about foreign companies coming to the US, tech firms, where they want to be, for decades it was Silicon Valley. They wanted to be close to the source of technological innovation. So firms leave and seek to enter places where the natural resources are, where markets are growing, where they may have the labor that promotes efficiency and innovation. Um, Now, I have a really fun example here that it's kind of dear to my heart. Oh, beer. Well, you're almost to the end of your paper, so you should be thinking about beer pretty soon here, or some type of beverage to help deal with the pain of this whole process. So this is kind of a fun one, and it is the same question that I'm asking in this slide, where to enter. So this is the story of Stone Brewing Company in Escondido, California, basically San Diego. Now, you may know that the craft beer industry has really, really been moving in the last 20 years. But what we didn't see a lot of was US craft beer companies internationalizing. While they may engaged in some type of export model, we did not see greenfield operations until very recently. One of the first was Stone Brewing Company. So where would they go? What type of culture would be open towards beer, specifically very hoppy beer? What type of factors would they need to take in consideration as they entered this place? So I want you to watch these three clips, and they're kind of fun. And if it's if it's in the evening, then maybe get yourself a stone beer and enjoy the clip with the product that they produce. If it's the morning, well, you know, don't. All right, so take a look at those and just to think about where to enter. Now, moving forward. Okay, so we've talked just a little bit about this. I kind of just gave a brief overview here. But it's, yeah, where to enter, where would you go? You would think, how do I get the things that I use to make my good or service so that it will be cheaper, right? I want to avoid transaction costs. So you should be asking yourself, have the firms in my strategic group gone to other places and utilized any of the resources that were local? Have they gone to places to find new customers? Have they gone to places to find low cost labor or other low cost inputs? Or, like I mentioned before, are they going to places to achieve what are called agglomeration economies? So, just like economies of scale, that lower cost agglomeration economies are where firms locate near other firms that provide inputs to avoid transaction costs. Now, we could also think of how this process goes down. Some firms have an issue with entering into a new market, and it may be cheaper to, rather than greenfield operation, buy your way in. Now, I give this example here of Asda, and for those of you who have been to Great Britain, Asda is now Walmart. And early on, Walmart recognized that it would be very difficult to enter into this market because Asda and Tesco are very similar to what Walmart has been trying to be. But basically, Tesco and Asda had the goodwill of the nation. So what did Walmart do? Well, don't start Walmart, just buy out Asda. Turn it into Walmart slowly. And for those of you that have been in Asda in the last 10 to 15 years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is exactly a Walmart. The bamboo floors, the lighting, the products, it is Walmart in a nutshell. And now it is a major rival of Tesco, which is a grocery and has expanded into becoming a little bit more of a retail store, but mostly grocery. So the thing is, firms enter where they fit. Walmart entered into this market first because the idea of a big box retail grocery store made sense. So that's something that you would have to consider is you're asking yourself, why did my firms enter into these markets? Did it fit, right? Did it just make sense? Was it a natural progression? The cost of cultural kind of diversification and then acculturation can be excessive. And so one main economic reason why a firm enters into certain locations over others is those costs are alleviated and can be avoided. Now, in terms of strategic reasons, could be close to the supply chain. The location could have expectations of future economic growth. And there could also be something very real in today's world, political power. So firms sometimes enter into countries where they don't go through traditional market chains, but they work with local governments for better or for worse. Notice my picture of an oil field. We have to think those relationships are very much a relationship between companies and foreign governments. Now, again, where to enter? Where the market is obvious. And that was something I was alluding to earlier in the case of Greyhound and Megabus. People knew how bus transport worked, but in the US, we pretty much gave up on it for long term or for long distance. What Megabus saw was an in, saw a changing culture and saw a changing age group. And what they saw was the millennials, who were focused a little less on some of the traditional means of living. So maybe not always having two cars, a house, and so forth and so on, but liked the idea of bus travel and cheap bus travel. So how would they enter? Well, they could not be Greyhound. So they did something very interesting. They, one, did not build bus depots. Two, they said that they would have dollar fares depending upon the number of riders. Three, they put in tables with USB ports and simple things that made bus travel a little less awkward and bizarre. And they tried to camouflage the kind of status that Greyhound had accumulated over time. Uh, they actually eliminated the whole bus depot thing, and then they would just meet at, they just arrive at kind of popular destinations. So even here in Kansas City, you can find Superbus down in the River Market, and they just pull up at a curb and they utilize the parking lot. You can park your car there. I mean, it's not on them. You face the liability, but that now becomes the ad hoc bus depot. Kind of an interesting model, but it really, really worked for them, particularly in the East Coast. Now, there's a few ways that firms can enter in terms of the model, the structure. Now, these sound a little bit more academic than they really are. Home replication. All right, so just look at what I've written to explain it. Just duplicate the domestic operation. So if I did something here, I'm going to do it exactly the same way there. Really no big change. This, you may think, well, that's kind of like fast food. Fast food even has to really change to fit that cultural circumstance. But if it was some type of manufacturing plant, the way that they're going to manufacture really isn't going to change. So much so. That's kind of the benefit of this home replication model, is that you figured out how to do it. You should be able to do it anywhere. Localization. All right. So this would be more like the franchise model. You basically make everything about the same, except you change it up just a few pieces. You localize it just a little bit. Global standardization. Now, this is when we're getting into the bigger side of internationalization. This is where basically you're using the world as a workshop. Excuse me. This is where you have to say, okay, I don't need to think about culture at all. The purpose of this internationalization model is to find the cheapest and most value added supply chain. So if at home you face supplier pressure, well, use the world as a marketplace. Use one country for this input, use another country for this input, use another country for this input, and make the world a workshop. Lastly is this transnational approach. This is kind of like the huge international conglomerates. They would have to use the world as a workshop, but at the same time may need to focus on localness. So you can think of this like if you ever see a corporation that has, say, Samsung USA versus Samsung Europe, what they're doing is the world is their workshop in terms of production, but they localize their operations to appear as a local subsidiary. So you're asking yourself, okay, how have my firms gone about? And again, you may be in one or more of these categories depending upon the history of the firm. So they may have started out as a home replication, but through time have grown to be a transnational situation, or a combination of the other two as well. Now, firms would also have to say, okay, maybe there's another approach. Maybe I need to try it out first. So the case of Chipotle, very well received in the U.S. until a couple of mix-ups in the last 10 years. But they said, okay, well, maybe we can sell burritos around the world. So they entered into a couple of experiments by going into England and London particularly, and seeing if Chipotle would work. They did not necessarily have the best results, but they were trying to figure out how a marketplace would work in different places. So you could also see this. It does seem to be the case with these franchised restaurants, Pizza Hut and McDonald's. They have to go and figure out what does the local audience like, and they do that on small scale experiments and then scale up based on what they find. Now, there could be even further. So we've gotten a sense of how to enter in terms of strategy. We've got the sense of where to enter in terms of could be industry pressure, could be resource pressure, could be pest pressure. So the next piece is, okay, well, what's it going to look like? In the case of Stone, which you might have already seen now, they entered into an equity mode. They bought a gas plant in Berlin and turned it into a new brewery. But not all firms would think of creating a complete new facility, a massive greenfield operation. So it really comes down to the level of commitment that companies want to have as they internationalize. Chipotle, for example, they left, and their operation was so small that the exit costs were almost minimal. So that's kind of the next step. How did your firms enter? Did they take an equity mode or did they take a non-equity mode? Did they engage in some type of joint venture with a company that already exists in the foreign location, or did they set up their own operation entirely? So just mentioning a joint venture versus a export model. So, like for example, when in the export model, think of like the grocery store and all the products that say like made in Italy. Well, clearly they don't have operations in the U.S. Those are export models. They work with distributors, and they then sell those products at retail spots. So how are your companies operating? I guess in the case of franchises, it's actually a little bit more difficult than you think because the franchisees may have to report to the domestic location and also report to the domestic management of the parent company. Something to consider as you think about your groups. You could use this decision model to kind of gain a sense of how to describe the mode of entry for your firms. But other than that, it is just a replication of what we've been talking about so far. So this is what you're trying to get at, okay? If your firms are globalizing, or if there is pressure to globalize, that's the argument you're trying to make here. What you're trying to do is say some discussion about how firms have globalized and what structure they took. Okay, so at this point in your paper, you've written so much, and this is really just kind of a final analysis here. Uh, how have they gone about expanding their markets? This will then lead you into your final analysis. Okay, so this is thinking about those final concluding remarks. And you're going to have to come back to this if your companies aren't necessarily global. Do you see it as a reasonable approach for your group? Is there pressure to do so? When do you think it's going to happen? So there won't be an entire segment or module for the concluding remarks. This is where your opinion comes in for your group, for yourself. What would you suggest to a new entrant? What would you say to a new rival before entering this market? You've done all this analysis in the last 7 weeks. What did you get from it? And what would you tell somebody if they paid you to provide them with information about this strategic group and industry as a whole? Additionally, if you had to talk to the firms in your group, where do you think they should go to ensure some type of continuity? So I think the final piece, you don't need to have any references here. This is really citing the work that you've done so far, a summary piece, but also kind of a forward-looking piece. A page or so I think would be fine, and really just trying to get at what's next. Maybe you say this is the end. The industry is mature. These firms seem to be in their static position. There doesn't seem to be a lot of growth opportunities. They just need to maintain status. Maybe you see something fundamentally different. Maybe the industry has been shaken up by five force factors or pest factors. What should these firms do? Maybe you see that the industry is very, very open and there is a lot of room for growth. What were some of the reasons or what are some of the facts that you found that would say your opinion at this point about what to do